Okay, what I'd like to do this week, again, we're taking a break from our Nach. Really, our limud is Nach, Sefer Yoshua right now, but we're taking a little break to discuss some inyanim of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Last week we were doing Slichos. What I'd like to do for the 3 days this week is I'd like to cover a part of the Yom Kippur service that is extremely important, but many people ignore. It's kind of very dramatic. And that is the seder of the Avodah of the Yom Kippur Korbanos that is recited at length in Musaf. For people who are lamdanim, people who are in learning, this by far is their favorite part of the Yom Kippur service because it matches the Gemaras in Yuma and all of the different machloksim, and they'll point out, oh, this line follows Rashi's Shita, and this line follows the Rambam Shita, and lamdanim like to focus on it. On the other hand, for many people, it's just a mystery that they just mumble through without having a sense of what is going on. So first, a little background in terms of the poetics of it. I'd like to say that there's only two people in the world who care about the poetic rhythms of piyutim. One is me and one is my son who got it from me. And we're kind of the only two people. But it actually is a very, very interesting type of limud. Piyutim are characteristic. These are additions, right? These were not the original nusach of Shmona Esrei. The Anshe Knesset Agdola gave us a nusach. Piyutim are various poems that were added in the course of time during the Middle Ages, mainly from Eretz Yisrael, but other countries as well. Now, the truth is, there are piyutim on almost every Shabbos of the year. Thousands and thousands of piyutim on everything. But most of them we don't say at all. Most of them we don't even know where they are, except for specialists, etc. But Yomim Noraim, in particular, we incorporate a number of piyutim. And by the way, if you look at your Raskol Machzor, you see that we skip a lot of them that are in the Machzor. The Machzor itself only has a small fraction of the piyutim, and we don't even say everything. And the reason is because Tov Ma'at V'Kavana, it is indeed more important to say things a little bit with kavana than to say a lot of words without kavana. That's why even slichos is a genre of piyutim, and we don't say all the slichos either, right? We skip around because better to say less with more kavana. But just to give you one example about piyutim that's very, very fascinating, if you pay attention to structure, again, I'm not saying it's ultimate importance, but it's very interesting. There is a piyut that we recite both the first day of Rosh Hashanah and the second day of Rosh Hashanah, which describes the attribute of Hashem, and it ends with the phrase Melech Elyon, the highest God. And we have one version of that poem, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and a different version of that poem, the second day of Rosh Hashanah. In point of fact, the poems were written by two different people. Day one of Rosh Hashanah is the most famous of the Paitanim, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir. Day two was a Rebbe of Rashi, Rav Shimon Bar Yitzchak. So apparently, the notion of a Melech Elyon poem was a common thing that many, many different people wrote versions of. And of the many Melech Elyons that are out there, so the two that found their way into the Machzor is Rabbi Elazar HaKalir on day one and Rav Shimon Bar Yitzchak on day two. Okay, now, it's interesting that the Melech Elyon is written as an alphabetical acrostic. You have a verse beginning with Aleph, then the next letter, etc. But it's interesting that it skips a letter. You will notice stanza 1 is Aleph. Stanza 2 is Gimel. Stanza 3 is Hey. Stanza 4 is Zayin. In other words, it's an Aleph Beis acrostic, but it skips every other letter. This is true both in Rav Kalir's version of day one of Rosh Hashanah and Rav Shimon Bar Yitzchak, who's called Rav Shimon Gadol. And by the way, these Paitanim were Gedolei Olam. I mean, Rashi, in his different commentaries, in Nach and even in the Gemara, will quote both Rabbi Elazar HaKalir and Rav Shimon Bar Yitzchak. I mean, they are quoted by Rishonim to bring rayas to various things and the like. Now, you'll then notice that after we finish the Melech Elyon, or when we finish the next to the last stanza, we close the ark, and then we say two stanzas in an undertone called Melech Evyon. Melech Elyon is the almighty supreme God. Melech Evyon is the wretched, impoverished human king. And it says Melech Evyon is this and that and that and that and that and that and that, worthless. And then we open up the ark and we have the last verse, Avo Melech Elyon is this. Now, you'll notice that the two stanzas of Melech Evyon that is said in an undertone when the ark is closed, the first stanza begins with Beis. As Melech Evyon is Bola, he's worn away. And the next stanza begins with Shin. Beis and Shin. What's going on? I'm sorry, not Beis and Shin, Beis and Tuf. Beis and Tuf. The answer is that the original poem of Melech Elyon had alternating stanzas. So the Aleph was talking about the greatness of God. The Beis verse talked about the insignificance of the human king. The Gimel verse talked about the greatness of God. The Dalet talked about the insignificance. Now, it would have been hard, as it were, to open and close the ark after every stanza. But the original piyut was Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, Aleph to Taf, in alternating Elyon, Evyon, Elyon, Evyon, Elyon, Evyon. This is true for both versions of the poem. What happened in the course of time, and we really don't know who made those decisions, but at some point the Kehilos decided, we will delete all the Melech Evyon refrains and only keep the Melech Elyon, and thus we're left with an Aleph, Gimel, Hey, Zayin. But in order to preserve something of the original, we will recite at the end the first Melech Evyon, which is Beis, and the last Melech Evyon, which is Taf. And that's why you have at the end of the piyut the two Melech Evyons, which were the first and the last in the original piyut. Right? Again, I'm not saying necessarily this is going to drastically improve your kavanah in davening, which is the most important thing, but it is interesting to see the structure of how the machzor works. Did you want to? You had a hand up. No. The what?
Just to note, this is also Islamic liturgy or just not?
No, it's a Ashkenazic liturgy. Rav Kalir and Shimra Yizkor are Ashkenazic paitanim. Sfardim have a different minhag in a lot of these things. Okay, so these are paitanim. Now, we're going to focus on the Yom Kippur Avodah. The Yom Kippur Avodah is a detailed step-by-step of what the Cohen Gadol did on Yom Kippur. The importance of the Avodah is the pasuk in the Navi Hosea that we just read about in the Haftarah this past Shabbos. Uneshalme parim sefasenu. We replace the korbanos by our words and by our prayers. And we don't have the Beis HaMikdash today. We don't have the Yom Kippur service today. All we have are our prayers. So by reciting it and by thinking about it, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will look at it as if we brought the korbanos. So the idea that you need to say the Seder Avodah is part of the kiyum of the pasuk, the fulfillment of the pasuk, uneshalma parim sifasenu, that we will pay the bulls, the korbanos, with our lips. And therefore, even in the Gemara in Maseches Yuma, it talks about a chazan in Chazaras Hashatz saying the Seder Avodah, but it doesn't give us a nusach. It doesn't say what he said. Seder Avodah. It is likely that the original Seder Avodah was simply reading the psukim of the Torah itself. Parshas Acharei Mos is the Seder of Avodah of Yom Kippur, although you have to augment it with Torah Shebal Peh in terms of understanding things. So the original Seder Avodah was not a piyut. It was not a poem. It was not a dramatic rendition. It was simply reading the psukim themselves. That was the earliest Seder Avodah. But later in the Middle Ages, with the growth of piyutim, there were many, many poetic renditions of the Seder Avodah. There's like over at least 50 different renditions of the Seder Avodah that were written by many, many poets. Now, all of them, it's different poetry, but all of them are based on the same primary source. And the primary source, besides the Chumash itself, is the Mishnah of Maseches Yuma. Maseches Yuma is the Maseches dealing with Yom Kippur. But do you know, it's very interesting. Maseches Yuma has 8 prakim. 7 out of the 8 prakim are about the Avodah of Yom Kippur. It is only the 8th parak, the very end of the Maseches, that are the laws of the fast of Yom Kippur. Which means 90% of Maseches Yuma is about korbanos. Only 10% of Maseches Yuma is about the fast of Yom Kippur. That's why when you look at the Rif in the back of Maseches Yuma, and the Rif only brings the Gemaras that are Nogeya today, he starts with Perek Ches. He does not bring anything from Perek Aleph to Zayin. So in many ways, Yuma, which is in Seder Moed, is much more connected to Seder Kachim than it is to Seder Moed. But those who learn Maseches Yuma, even Mishnayos, know that the first 7 prakim go through the Seder Avodah in great detail, including Machloksim, of course, and all of the poetic piyutim of the Seder Avodah based on the sequence as given in Maseches Yuma. However, they have to take halachic positions, meaning a piyut does not say, oh, this is a machlokas. Every piyut is machriya a certain halachic position. So, as I say, there are many, many piyutei avodah. I think around 100 of them. But in the overwhelming majority of Klal Yisrael, there's only 2 that are in the Machzor. Ashkenazim have a piyut that is called Amitz Koach. Sfardim, including Edut HaMizrach, have a piyut that is called Atah Konanta. And it's fascinating, one of the things that Lamdanim love to do is they love to compare Amitz Koach and Atah Konanta, and they try to show that Amitz Koach is following these Rishonim, and Atah Konanta is following those Rishonim, and because, again, 90% is the same, other than the poetry. It's the same, but there are halachic differences, and the halachic differences go back to Machloksim in the Rishonim, Machloksim in the Gemara, that the Mechaber of Amitz Koach paskined a certain way, the Mechaber of Atah Konanta paskined a different way, and it gets into not only Rashi, Tosfos, Rambam, but it gets into Bavli, Yerushalmi. So again, there's a lot that one could be mefalpel in the fascinating details of the Seder Avodah. Now, the Ashkenazi piyuts and the Sephardi piyuts, as well as the 98 others, all follow. It's interesting that somehow there was a standardized way you present it, even poetically. There was just like you have a sonnet or whatever, poems have certain structures. The Seder Avodah, across 100 of them, follow the same structure, and it kind of resembles Google Maps. You know how Google Maps starts with, picture of the Earth, and then you zoom in on North America, then you zoom in on whatever it is, on the state of New York, then you zoom in New York City, and then you do Rockefeller Center. It starts with this gigantic, big picture, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then you're at your point. Every Seder Avodah is written the same way, although different poetry. It starts with, God created a universe of animals and plants and stars and constellations. And then he chose Adam to be the purpose of Bria. And from Adam he then chose Avraham. And from Avraham he chose Yitzchak and rejected Yishmael. And from Yitzchak he chose Yaakov and rejected Esav. And then from Yaakov he chose Levi to be the tribe that is designed to be holy to Hashem. And of Shevet Levi he chose Aaron to be the Kohen. And that's your final point. And then it starts the Seder Avodah, meaning it always starts the Seder Avodah by saying, Hashem created this beautiful world. and it narrows it and narrows it and narrows it and narrows it till you have the primary focus. This is a stylistic feature of all Sidrei Avodah. I don't know who invented it, but all of the Sidrei Avodah are written that way, and that's why in Amitz Koach and Atakonanta, you will find that it begins with a description of Hashem creating the world, and how Hashem whittles down his choices as to who will be the one that carries on the mission and the purpose of creation. Now, here's some good news for Sfardim. Amitz Koach is written in typical Ashkenazi piyutim language, which is complicated, convoluted. Atakonanta is written in a much straightforward, easy to understand language. That's one thing, okay. But more importantly is, many poskim have said that Atakonanta is halachically the more accurate nusach of the seder avoda based on halacha. And as a result, there were some Ashkenazi Gedolim who were makbid that even though they daven nusach Ashkenaz, when they said the seder avoda, they said Atakonanta instead of Amitz Koach. So although the Art Scroll doesn't do this, but if you have some old machzorim, you will actually see in older Ashkenazi machzorim, Amitz Koach will be above the line, and then there'll be a line, and it will say, some Ashkenazim say Atakonanta, because halachically, Atakonanta was considered to be the more accurate seder of avoda. Or alternatively, what some Ashkenazim did is a little more daring. They actually made changes in Amitz Koach. They changed they changed the sentence here and there so it would match with Atakonanta. So whether they simply said Atakonanta legamre, or whether they said Amitz Koach, but they incorporated changes, these were two different approaches that recognized the greater halachic accuracy of Atakonanta. Nevertheless, most Ashkenazim, myself, I'm the minig of the yeshiva, is that we just go with what the machzer says. The typical Ashkenazi machzer does have the piyut of Amitz Koach, so we go with Amitz Koach. I will mention, as we go through it, I'll mention some of the differences. Again, I want to emphasize, 95% it is the same. I'm not going to say it's horrendously different, but there are some interesting, significant differences there. Okay. The author of Amitz Koach, there's an author. His name is Rav Meshulam Berebi Klonimus. Meshulam Berebi Klonimus. This is a generation or two before Rashi. Meshulam Berebi Klonimus was of a very famous, prestigious Torah family of Gedolim from Italy. He was an Italian Paitan, and he is the Mechaber of Amitz Koach. The way we know this is that after the Aleph Beis, Amitz Koach goes through the Aleph Beis acrostics, and then it spells his name, Meshulam Berebi Klonimus Chazak. So his name is encoded in the piyut. The author of Atakonanta is a bit mysterious. He is said to be Yossi ben Yossi, Cohen Gadol. That's what his title is. Yossi ben Yossi, the Cohen Gadol. Some have said that Atakonanta is so old, it does not date from the Middle Ages. It actually dates from the Beis HaMikdash itself. And Yossi ben Yossi was actually a Cohen Gadol who officiated in the Beis HaMikdash. That, of course, would explain why Atakonanta may have more halachic authority. This is the guy who actually did the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Others say that that's not a raya, because they say Cohen Gadol was sometimes used as a term of honor for a very great person, a great Cohen. Meaning, just because he's called in the chronicles of history, Yossi ben Yossi Cohen Gadol, does not automatically suggest he was a Cohen Gadol. For example, the Chafetz Chaim or Sameach, both of whom were Kohanim. They would often be called HaKohen HaGadol Me'achav, the great Kohen of the generation. Right? So it's not a right. So therefore, I have to say that how old Atakonanta is a bit of a mystery. Some will date it all the way back to the time of the Beis HaMikdash. And some say, no, it's around the same time as Meshulam Rav Klonimus, a medieval poet, but he was called Cohen Gadol because he was a very esteemed. And by the way, some say that the whole authorship, the whole attribution to Atar Konanta, to Yossi ben Yossi, is a mistake because there's another piyut, Atar Konanta. It begins with the same two words, but a different piyut, and that's the one that was written by Yossi Rav Yossi. And this Atar Konanta was written by somebody unknown. So we don't even know if Yossi ben Yossi is the correct author of this version of Atar Konanta. Right? There are other versions of Atar Konanta. Again, that was for some reason, those two words were a beginning of a number of Sidrei Avodah, and sometimes the printers misattributed the author of one Atar Konanta to another Atar Konanta. Okay? So these are our two poetic renditions. They are based on the same primary source, and that is the Mishnah in the first 7 prakim of Maseches Yuma, but at various points they're machriya halachically in different ways. Okay, so now a few basic things. To understand the Seder Avodah generally, we'll simply look at it as a play. I don't mean that with a lack of reverence. A play in 5 acts. Now, the one thing you need to know about Yom Kippur is that the entire Yom Kippur service, with some very, very rare exceptions, must be done by the Cohen Gadol exclusively. Now, during the year, the Cohen Gadol was not necessarily involved in the Avodah. He had the right to come in whenever he wanted. Whenever the Cohen Gadol wanted to bring a korban, he had the right to come in and override the mishmors, override everybody. But most of the time, he let the cycle go. Many Kohanim did the Avodah during the year. But on Yom Kippur, everything must be done by the Cohen Gadol. A Kohen Hedjot is not kosher for any part of the Yom Kippur service. Now, when I say everything must be done by the Cohen Gadol, it's very important that you understand, we don't only mean the special Yom Kippur service must be done by the Cohen Gadol. Rather, we mean even the things that you do every day. The korban tamid that is brought every day in the morning and the afternoon. You don't need the Kohen Gadol to bring the korban tamid. On Yom Kippur, he must. So it's not just the Yom Kippur things that require a Kohen Gadol. It is even the daily avodah in the Mikdash, which was also done on Yom Kippur, that requires the Kohen Gadol. So as we go through this, you'll see what a rough day physically the Cohen Gadol had to go through. It really was a marathon, although it's interesting that he probably had around a 2 to 3 hour break in the afternoon, which in a sense makes it even more unusual because there was so much to do and only one guy could do it, and they still had a big break. How they managed to do all of that creates interesting questions even today, because it's like, how do we have our break, or should we have our break if we have so much davening to do and the like? Well, they had that issue in the Beis HaMikdash itself, and somehow they managed to resolve it. Moreover, let me remind you that the Mishnah tells us in Maseches Yuma that the Kohen Gadol was not allowed to sleep the night of Yom Kippur. So in addition to having to work the entire day from morning to night, he was not allowed to sleep. And the reason is there was a fear that he might have a seminal emission at night if he fell asleep. And if he had a seminal emission, he would be tameh. He could not do the avodah the next day, so we would be stuck. So as a result, he was not allowed to sleep. And the Mishnah says, if he knew how to learn, he would learn. If he didn't know how to learn, we would read to him different stories from Nach, interesting stories. And if he would be drowsing off, the young Kohanim would flick their fingers on him to kind of keep him awake, etc. and then he had to do all his work all the day. Now the Mishnah mentions that actually he was quarantined in the Beis HaMikdash 7 days before Yom Kippur, meaning he left his home. He was put in a special chamber of the Beis HaMikdash. He wasn't isolated. People could talk to him, people could visit with him, and he was involved with people. But the purpose of this was to put him in a holy place where he could meditate, he could pray, he could purify himself in order to do the Avodah that will bring a kapara for Klal Yisrael. And for those 7 days, the Chachamim taught him exactly what the seder of the Avodah would be, what he has to do, etc. And then came Erev Yom Kippur, and as I say, that night, the night of Yom Kippur, he had to stay up all night. So point number one is that all of the Avodah of Yom Kippur must be done by the Cohen Gadol. Yeah.
Before you mentioned that perhaps the Cohen Gadol wouldn't have known how to learn, I thought because of Cohen Gadol, surely he would know how to learn.
Yeah. So the problem is this. The problem was, and this was a recurring problem, that there were many Kohanim Gedolim during the 420 years of the Second Temple period who were not righteous, and many of them were tzaddukim, many of them were Sadducees who didn't even believe in the oral law. How did they get their position? The answer is the Romans auctioned it off, meaning to say the Cohen Gadol was not just the Cohen Gadol, he was also considered to be the political representative of the Jewish community to the Roman government. In other words, the office of Cohen Gadol was both a political office and a religious office. If you look at the Christian Bible's accounts of Jesus, etc., and the involvement of the Cohen Gadol, you see very much the Cohen Gadol as political go-between with Roman officials. So next time you look at the New Testament, you could check it out. Yeah.
The mincha offering brought by the Kohen, was it brought at mincha katana or mincha gadol?
Yeah, based on the Yom Kippur schedule, it was mincha katana for sure. It was later.
Should that be an implication that
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would think that, I know you asked the guys remember, but I think the problem is that Yom Kippur was a little unusual because there was so much that had to be done. So, and you can't do anything after the Korban Tamid of the afternoon. In other words, the Korban Tamid of the afternoon has to be the last thing that you do. So everything that you do, you have to do before the Korban Tamid. So that kind of forced you to push it later. So, yeah.
the shechita he had to do?
Yes, he had to do the shechita too. That's good.
During the year, though, the Kohen doesn't have to do shechita.
That's correct. Even the things that didn't even need a Kohen, like shechita, the Kohen Gadol had to do shechita. Yeah.
The flicking, if you do it like this year, Yom Kippur is on Shabbat. How would that work if like they might have bruised them?
No, well, they'd have to be careful. First of all, there's a machlokas. Exactly what they did. Some say they actually flicked their fingers against his cheek. They hit him. Others say they just kind of made a noise next to him, and so he would hear it. They snap their fingers or whatever it would be. But in Echanami, you're 100% correct. Obviously, not just on Shabbos, even Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur has all the laws of Shabbos. So if you're not allowed to make a wound on Shabbos, you're equally not allowed to make a wound on Yom Kippur. So they would
Even
have
if
to.
it's for like a mitzvah.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it. I mean, there are other ways of waking somebody up. I mean, you're not going to say, "Oh, there's a mitzvah that you don't sleep, so I'm allowed to bruise you." I mean, you could wake him up by screaming at him or whatever it would be.
Yeah, but if it's a situation like Rashi brings by Yosef, that Yosef like dug his like nails into the ground to cause himself pain to prevent something worse. So if something like that happens to Kohen Yom Kippur, does that override that you're not supposed to cause injury?
I would say not because first of all, keep in mind there is be'etzem no issur of sleeping. I mean, it's only a chashash. He shouldn't sleep lest he have a seminal emission.
Right.
In theory, sleeping would have been okay, right? But it was a chashash. So I wouldn't say that to prevent him from sleeping, you'd be allowed to violate any halacha in that way. By the way, they say, the kids got, pleasure from this because, here's the Cohen Gadol, the holiest person, etc. And they get to flick him in the face a little bit. There used to be a minhag in Eastern Europe, not in the Gemara, and we don't do this minhag today. Maybe there are places that do it, in which on Erev Yom Kippur, you would get malchus, you would actually get beaten. They would take some branches, a brush, and beat. So I think in one of the Yiddish novels, they talk about a shamish. The shamish's job was to give malchus. And it was supposed to be gentle. It wasn't supposed to be it's really gentle. But the shamish didn't like the Rav, so he talked about psychologically the great pleasure he got once a year when he got to beat the Rav on the back, to give him malchus. And all of this is the way you treat me, and this is the way you treat me. Right. So the kids had kind of a little bit of a pleasure like that. But the thing about the Cohen Gadol is a very big inyan. In fact, the Gemara gives a fascinating story about Yoshua ben Gamla. Yoshua ben Gamla was a very righteous person. In fact, Yoshua ben Gamla was a Cohen Gadol during the Bayis Sheni, and he was the one who instituted the system. The original Jewish education was Vishinantam Levanecha, that a parent taught his son. There were no schools. A father would teach his son. Homeschooling. Chinuch was homeschooling until you went to an advanced yeshiva, if you did that. But basic education was parent to child. But Yeshua ben Gamla saw that not all parents were capable of doing this, and some kids were orphaned at young ages. So he created, Pashut, in fact, Judaism boasts, we are the first public education system in the ancient world. The Greeks didn't have public education. You had private tutors if you could afford it. We created chadorim, schools, which have to be funded by the community. In other words, people didn't pay tuition. The community, just like public schools, the community paid taxes to maintain chadorim. And this was a takana attributed to one person, Yehoshua ben Gamla. He is the inventor of the educational elementary system of Torah learning. He married the daughter of one of the richest people in Yerushalayim, and she brought in a huge, huge, huge dowry. And he spent it all to buy the office of Cohen Gadol from the Romans. He spent his entire wife's dowry to buy the Kahuna Gedola. Why? Because he wanted to keep it out of the hands of a Tzdukim. Tzdukim were rich. The Tzdukim tended to be the richer class, and that's why there were Kohanim Gedolim who were not learned, etc. And Yeshua ben Gamla actually bought the office, but he bought the office l'shem Shemayim. Yeah.
What gave the Romans the power to defend the Kohen Gadol?
Well, what gave the Romans the power was they had conquered Eretz Yisrael. They were the ruling authority. So essentially, the Romans did whatever they wanted to do, meaning the Romans would not let the Jewish people make the decision themselves. The Romans decided who they wanted as Kohen Gadol. In fact, it's recorded in some sources that there were times that the Kohen Gadol wasn't even a Kohen. Although I don't think in Chazal there's any such source, but in some historical records there was such a thing. That absolutely creates a tremendous problem, because that means that whatever was done on Yom Kippur would have been absolutely worthless. It would have been usher, number one, and it would have been worthless and usher at the same time. Question? Yeah.
I imagine that usually the Kohen Gadol was an elderly man. Was there ever a concern that he'd be unable to perform the Avodah, which is exhausting after a night of no sleep?
Yeah. So remember, 100% correct. Obviously, there might be times of illness or infirmity or age, and that's why there was an office called Sagan Cohen Gadol, Vice Cohen Gadol, just like vice president, that if the president gets incapacitated, so the vice president can step in. So there was a designated person who could replace the Cohen Gadol and had the status of Sagan Cohen Gadol. Yeah.
It seems like from what I'm hearing about the Kohen Gadols and the Beis Sheni, that they would have just all died in the Kodesh Kadoshim because they weren't proper.
Yeah. So the Gemara makes the point that the Bayis Sheni, the Bayis Rishon stood 410 years. The Bayis Sheni stood 420 years. And in the 420 years, there were more than 300, close to 400 Cohen Gadols. And some of the righteous Cohen Gadols were actually Cohen Gadols for many years. Shimon HaTzadik for 40 years, another one for 80 years. So when you take out the long terms, that means the average tenure of a Cohen Gadol was a year or less. A year or less. Meaning they didn't last a year. Now, some understand that to mean that if a Cohen Gadol was not on a high madrega, if he entered the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he would actually die in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And there is a Zohar that says, it's a Zohar, not a Gemara, that they used to tie a rope or a chain around the leg of the Cohen Gadol. So if he went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and didn't come out after a reasonable time, we would have to assume that he died. So we would pull the rope. It was a long rope. We couldn't go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but we could pull the rope and pull him out. And according to the Zohar, it would seem quite frightening that most Cohen Gadols died on Yom Kippur in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But I want to make it very, very clear that the Bavli never says, the Bavli does make the point that most Cohen Gadols did not survive the year. But it never makes the point they died in the Kodesh HaKadoshim itself. And many understand that they were allowed to finish. God would not want to mar Yom Kippur with Cohen Gadol dying all the time. But it means that he didn't survive the year, meaning he finished the Yom Kippur service, he would die a week later, 6 months later, 10 months later, meaning it was kind of a death sentence. But it did not occur right away, and according to the Bavli, they did not tie any rope or chain around the Cohen Gadol. So it seems that the statement that people say is from the Zohar, the Bavli, Lav Dafka accepts it. But what that means is the following. After a few hundred years, you kind of get the idea that if you're not a big tzaddik, you're not going to survive the year. So why would people want to be Cohen Gadol? Why would they auction off the job? Why would they pay money for it? The answer is that this is the Yetzer Hara of Kavod. The Yetzer Hara of Kavod is so great that you're going to say, maybe I'll be the one that will make it. Maybe I'll be the one that will survive. And then I'm going to, be on TV and, Guinness Book of World Records, all of these things. And this is the idea of Kavod, right? People even today, they risk their lives. Think about extreme sports and stunts and all sorts of dangerous things. People do it for the Kavod. And they think they could fool God. Even though for 300 years, nobody survived, the year after Yom Kippur. But maybe I'm going to be the one, and I'm going to be world famous, and the like. Okay, but again, as I say, the Zohar's extreme position, that the Cohen actually died in the Kodesh HaKadoshim and we had to pull him out, the Bavli does not seem to be makabel. Okay? All right, maybe we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.